You think Mario 64 is overrated? Are you positive that's what you believe? Let me just check the opening of your video to make sure.
I said it. Mario 64 is the most overrated video game ever.
Damn, I guess that is his opinion. Nothing wrong with that. Let's see what his justifications are.
People constantly flaunt this game as revolutionary, and sometimes even the best 3D Mario game.
Okay, needlessly edgy joke that conflicts with the tone of the video so far, while also showing that you're willing to edit screenshots and therefore making you look a little less trustworthy aside, I want to discuss your use of Google AI as a source, even though it's infamous for its ability to give out misinformation.
The AI began to parrot facts and tips from sites like The Onion and Reddit, insisting that Barack Obama was Muslim, that gasoline can be used in cooking, and it recommended eating rocks as a vital source of vitamins and minerals. It even suggested adding glue to pizza, a tip internet sleuths tracked down to a decade-old Reddit post by a user named Fucksmith. But at least that lends credibility to its assertion that parrots can cook.
Wouldn't it have made more sense to look for a list of the greatest games of all time or something like that as opposed to trusting an AI? I mean, you said people are saying this, right? Then why not show some people as opposed to an artificial intelligence? For reference, there's a part later in the video where he says he's actually very curious as to why people feel the way they do about this game.
And I'm very curious to hear what people actually believe is so forward-thinking with this game. I hear Mario 64 being called revolutionary all the time, and I just don't see it. Like, is it the camera? Did it start open-world gameplay? I genuinely do not know. Please, someone tell me in the comments.
When you could just look it up, you could research why people find this game to be so revolutionary, and then determine if you agree or disagree with these reasons. Or you could try watching your own video, given you mention a way it's revolutionary.
This kind of loops back to my point on the game's revolutionariness. It was only really revolutionary in the way Mario, or cartoony 3D characters in general, control, which is granted quite the undertaking. But the biggest thing it evolved is the style of Mario games. It just took Mario's character and genre and slapped it into a bloated game of hide and seek.
But all of that, albeit rather backhandedly, gives ways the game was revolutionary. Now, somebody who wanted to talk more objectively, or even just more positively about the game than you did, might say something along the lines of what Niall O'Donoghue did in an article he wrote for VG247 in celebration of Mario 64's 25th anniversary. Quote, Mario 64 was instrumental for the generation of collectathon games which followed it, influencing the likes of Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and Spyro the Dragon. There was a sense that this is going to change everything and that this is going to be the future, Chris Sutherland, project director and software engineer at Playtonic Games, says. It was going to be less of the 2D stuff that we'd been doing, and it was going to be more and ultimately almost exclusively 3D, because that was where the future lay. Mark Stevenson, technical director at Playtonic, remembers being particularly impressed by the game's art, animation, and analog stick control scheme. It was pretty mind-blowing how they reimagined it in a 3D world, as well kind of captured the quintessential Mario experience but in 3D, Stevenson says. Both Stevenson and Sutherland worked on Yooka-Laylee, a crowd-funded retro-inspired 3D platformer developed by Playtonic and released in 2017. However, at the time of Mario 64, both worked for the acclaimed British development studio Rare, who had a close partnership with Nintendo throughout the 90s as a second-party development studio. Rare was working on Project Dream, an RPG originally in development for the SNES. The project was moved to the N64 upon the console's release, shifting to a linear 2.5D platformer. However, Mario 64 changed the course of the game's development into what eventually became Banjo-Kazooie. I find the use of ukulele in this article to be especially of note, given, sandwiched between the last two clips of him I played, is this.
It is rare that I see any mechanics taken from this game in modern or even older 3D platformers outside of Mario.
He says this while using footage of Yooka-Laylee, a game which only exists because of Mario 64. In general, I perpetually get the impression that this person doesn't really understand the opposing view, and I don't mean he doesn't agree with it or he doesn't think their logic holds up to scrutiny. I mean he genuinely does not really get why people don't agree with him. But that doesn't stop him from speculating as to why people don't think like him. Take this part, for example.
So why is the game still so damn popular? Many reasons, actually. The biggest one, without a doubt, being nostalgia. Whether fans want to admit it or not, the game has a fantastic vibe and soundtrack that's impossible to forget. So now that all the millennials are getting with the times and downloading social media, they've amassed a huge following while speedrunning reviewing Mario 64, and like the sheep Gen Z and Gen Alpha are, a lot of us followed suit. And now there's a whole army ready to die defending this game. That's my running theory. Either that or I'm blind and can't see a good video game when there's one right in front of me.
Or you just have a different subjective opinion than a lot of other people. And even then, a lot of your opinions really aren't that unorthodox. Your criticism of Blast Away the Wall, for example, is incredibly similar to a different video I showcased on this channel several months ago.
Also, in Womp's Fortress, during the Blast Away the Wall mission, it's pretty clear that you need to shoot yourself out of the cannon into a wall, but there's nothing to hit towards which wall you're supposed to hit. So you just end up mindlessly shooting yourself like an idiot at all visible walls, wasting a lot of time, or just looking up a guide, which is always boring and defeats the purpose of playing the game.
I assume since you're watching this, you've at least seen gameplay of Mario 64. If not, here, let me show you a star found in the second level of the game. This star is called Blast Away at the Wall. Sounds like you have to shoot yourself at a wall with a star on it, right? Welp, that's not the case, as you have to shoot yourself at this very random ass corner with no indication of where you have to shoot.
Similarly, I can't help but notice how you open your discussion of Mario 64's camera by essentially framing it as a long-made point about the game, which its fans are sick of hearing repeated.
What controls absolutely horribly is the camera, and if you're a fan of Mario 64, I'm sure you're tired of hearing complaints about it, and I'm not sorry. It's actually terrible.
Oh, he follows this part up by saying this.
Why does it spin on this platform in Womp's Fortress? Why? Not only that, but if you aren't constantly adjusting it, it'll get all zoomed in when there's a wall in front of you. I don't get why Nintendo made it this way. I really don't.
But I know for a fact that footage from Shifting Sandland does not come from the original N64 game or the 3D All-Stars port, but from the PC port made unofficially by fans. Yeah, that's something about this video which admittedly isn't that big of a deal, but is worth mentioning occasionally. He constantly switches between footage of the PC port and the original N64 game. At least I believe that's what it is, I could be wrong. This does lead to some amusing moments though, like the presence of Waluigi in a video on Super Mario 64, even though Waluigi wasn't in that game. He didn't even have his first appearance in the Mario series until Mario Tennis, which came out in 2000, 4 years after 64 was released. Similarly, I know for a fact you can't move the camera like this in the base Mario 64.
I'm going to say this right now. If not Nintendo, someone else would have done it. In the time Mario 64 came out, the 3D game development scene was already thriving. There were plenty of other game companies experimenting with 3D. Someone would have beaten Nintendo to the punch had there been more demand for platformers outside of Mario. Sonic does not count.
Yeah, that's great and all, but something being revolutionary isn't based on if someone else would have done that anyway. A completely nebulous proposition that you can neither prove nor disprove without a time machine, or maybe the ability to look into parallel universes. But instead based on what actually ended up happening in the universe we live in. Would somebody else have made a 3D platformer similar to Mario 64 if given enough time? Sure, maybe, but Nintendo's the one that did. There's also the important question of quality, as in, yeah, 3D games might have existed beforehand, but were they any good? What was the expectation of them at the time? Was it just a novelty that 3D games existed in the first place? Or was there an actual quality standard? If so, how high was it? You see, one of the things Mario 64 did that was absolutely revolutionary was raise the standard of quality expected in 3D games. We know this because of a game called Bubsy 3D. You see, although the game is currently incredibly infamous for its poor quality, that wasn't always the case. It actually got mixed to positive reviews when it first came out, with PS Extreme very infamously giving it the Gold X Award. Albeit that wasn't so much an actual award as just a simple way to demonstrate they thought the game was of an outstanding or worthwhile quality. This is because 3D platformers were really only seen as impressive on their own merits, as opposed to being quality games, if that makes sense. However, once that initial impressiveness wore off, people began analyzing these games based on their quality, and they found a lot more love for Mario 64 and a lot less for Bubsy 3D. This even happened on the team that made Bubsy 3D itself, who saw Super Mario 64 at the 1996 Consumer Electronics Show and begged Accolade, the company that was behind the game, for more time to heavily rework it because they realized they had just made something that was fucking horrible. That right there is a massive impact on the gaming industry that this video completely overlooks in its discussion.
Matter of fact, Mario 64 wasn't even the first 3D platformer. The first was this Alpha Waves game. While looking very primitive, it's still more revolutionary than Mario 64 since, well, it's the first of its kind. Yet no one talks about it.
First off, who exactly is claiming that Mario 64 was the first 3D platformer ever made? You haven't shown anyone saying that. Fuck, even your AI specifically acknowledges that, quote, it was one of the first 3D platform games, not the absolute first. It then goes on to say, quote, Super Mario 64 was not the first 3D game or even the first 3D platformer. However, it became the pioneer of the 3D platforming genre and 3D gaming in general. And by the way, what do you mean by more revolutionary? Are you arguing that Mario 64 wasn't revolutionary on its own, or that it wasn't the single most revolutionary 3D platformer of all time? Because those are incredibly different arguments. Also, revolutionariness, which I guess is a word now, I mean, he even uses it at one point.
So I am just disregarding Mario 64's revolutionariness.
Is not based on what came first. If I were to apply this logic to its extreme, well, this Alpha Wave game you're showing wasn't really revolutionary because it wasn't the first video game ever made. Alpha Waves came out in 1990, something you don't mention in the video for some reason, even though giving an exact release date would actually help you in this case. Hell, you could even just try citing a source, something else you don't do. But there had been video games going as far back as the late 1950s.
And third, the first game? Like it's the first video game ever made? That's debatable. The Odyssey came out the same year, and that was being worked on since the 60s. And before that, there was Space War, and if you really want to go back, there's those old games made out of radar equipment like Tennis for Two.
Tennis for Two was released in 1958 and is widely seen as the first video game ever made. Therefore, it is infinitely more innovative for every genre, 3D platformers included, than Alpha Waves is. So why aren't you talking about how this is actually the most revolutionary game ever?
There's really no reason to go back to either outside simplicity, performance, nostalgia, or community reasons, which I'll touch up about later.
There's really no reason to go back to this game outside of the 4 reasons you just provided.
The level selection's overall bad. I'm just gonna say it. Mario 64 really doesn't feel like a 3D platformer at times. A good chunk of the levels feel like small open zone snow globes that you just walk through and randomly find stars. Outside of the first few stars, there aren't many objectives that are all that clear. I know that's somewhat intentional to get the player to explore these zones, but the majority of the time you'll just uncover them by accident.
Wait a second, why exactly is that the antithesis of 3D platforming to you? How are you defining what a 3D platformer is, and why does Mario 64 not always feel like it should qualify? You're making a rather large claim here.
And a lot of stars, I swear you can't even get without a guide. Take, for example, in Tiny Huge Island, in order to get the 5th star, you need to make it to 5 ultra-specific locations, but there's nothing to signify what locations qualify towards the count outside of a number popping up when you do find one.
So there's nothing to signify it except for an incredibly simple way to determine that you have found one of the 5 secrets. This is made even worse by the fact that this is the small version of Tiny Huge Island, easily the smallest area in the game, so it's not as if there are a lot of places you can check. I could understand this complaint more if maybe the area was larger, but as it stands, I'm confused as to what else the game could have. I'm not even saying a superior way of doing this doesn't exist, but you don't say what it is, so I'm just left confused.
Using Bob-omb Battlefield as an example kind of sucks because it's the first level in the game, so you'd expect it to be easy anyway, but that's still 1 out of 15 levels, almost 7% of the game. And in Bob-omb Battlefield, you can literally get the first couple stars here without jumping.
You can actually beat the entirety of Mario 64 without jumping. In fact, somebody did that shortly after this video came out, albeit it took him 86 hours and was clearly not the intended method. I mention this because I'm confused as to what you mean here. You say it's possible to beat these 2 stars without jumping. Okay, how easy is it? How realistic is it even? The aforementioned run, which beat the entire game without jumping, used a variety of incredibly difficult glitches, many of which were believed to only be doable through tool-assisted speedrunning up until rather recently. How do I know this isn't just a microcosm of that?
As I just said, on one hand, you've got missions that are triply easy, and on the other hand, some missions are borderline impossible without wasting too much time or looking up a guide.
How long is too much time, though? That's an entirely subjective judgment that, without further elaboration, doesn't really communicate anything to your audience.
The bottom line of this segment is, the levels just aren't overall good. And if you don't agree with me, ask yourself this. Do you really enjoy Rainbow Ride's sluggish carpet and terrible 100 coin process? Do you really like climbing up Tall Mountain 8 times in a row? Do you really like losing all of your progress falling down TikTok clock with one mistake?
Do you ever whistle just for the fun of it?
Seriously, what kind of questions even are those? I especially find the one about Rainbow Rides having a terrible 100 coin mission objectionable because obviously, if I thought it was terrible, I probably wouldn't like it. It's the same thing with you calling the carpet sluggish. Well, that's a subjective judgment that you are entitled to, but asking me if I enjoy something after you already prescribed the negative label to it is just a leading question. You also don't have to climb up Tall Mountain 8 times. The area has 7 stars if you count the 100 coin star, and you don't even need to climb up the entire mountain for all of them. The red coins, for example, are located very close to where the level spawns you in. As for TikTok clock, no, I don't enjoy losing all my progress, but I do enjoy overcoming the challenges of the level. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that I could fail doing such, therefore making it a test of skill.
Nintendo believed this game was worth approximately $10 with terrible input lag in 2013, and they had the balls to charge $20 in 2020 with the 3D All-Stars collection. This is of course given that Nintendo sold the package with the intention each game cost an equal split, which is highly unlikely, but still.
I like how you just kind of admit your mathematics are based on an incorrect premise and then don't do anything about it. Why not just stop at the $10 point? Why bring up it potentially being sold for $20 under what you admit is a pretty flimsy grounds?
This is like a $5 game at max that you'd pick up on sale for $2.
So the game's worth $2 then and not $5? What? Anyway, final thoughts. I highly doubt every copy of this video is personalized. Good night and good luck.